No one expected sparks to fly quite like this. When Jasmine Crockett joined Piers Morgan for what was supposed to be a measured conversation on politics and culture, neither the producers nor the audience anticipated just how far it would go. But what started as a routine interview quickly unraveled into one of the most heated on-air moments in recent memory. The clash wasn't just emotional, it was personal, raw, and unfiltered. And by the time it was over, both reputations and assumptions were left in pieces. Make sure to like and subscribe to stay updated on more powerful stories like this. The studio lights gleamed down on Jasmine Crockett as she took her seat across from Piers Morgan, a journalist known for his sharp tongue and relentless style. From the outset, there was an undercurrent of tension, an unspoken knowledge that this conversation might not follow the usual script. Crockett, a rising political figure with a reputation for measured grace, was no stranger to tough interviews. But even she could not have predicted how quickly the atmosphere would shift. As Morgan launched into his questions, it became clear the topic was heading into dangerous waters. "Do you really think race still plays the role in politics that you claim it does?" he asked, his voice steady but probing. The question hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Was this a fair inquiry or an attempt to bait? Jasmine's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is it really that simple?" she responded. "How can anyone deny the lasting impact of race on every aspect of life in this country? From education to law, enforcement, from healthcare to housing. Why do some still pretend these are just isolated incidents?" Morgan leaned forward, eyebrows raised. "But aren't some people using race as a shield? To deflect from personal responsibility? To create division where none exists?" The exchange was electric, charged with history and raw emotion. What followed was not a polite debate, but a fierce confrontation. Crockett challenged Morgan's framing at every turn, refusing to accept simplifications that glossed over systemic realities. She asked, "How do you explain the statistics, then? How do you justify the disparities if not through the lens of race?" At this point, Morgan's usual confidence began to waver. He pressed, "Are you suggesting everything is about race? That nothing else matters?" The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Was this the moment Crockett would lose control? Would Morgan finally land a decisive blow? Instead, she held firm. "No, I am saying it's one of the most important lenses. If we ignore it, we ignore truth." Rhetorical questions echoed. How long can society afford to pretend otherwise? How many voices need to be silenced for comfort's sake? And what price does denial demand? The viewers at home watched, caught in the tension, wondering, would this conversation deepen understanding or deepen divides? The tension in the studio was palpable as the exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Piers Morgan intensified. The initial probing questions had shifted into an all-out battle of wills, with each side refusing to concede ground. Morgan, known for his relentless style, was visibly unsettled by Crockett's unwavering stance. He shifted tactics, trying to unsettle her with pointed remarks and loaded questions designed to provoke an emotional response. "You speak of systemic racism like it's an unquestionable fact," Morgan said, his tone sharp. "But doesn't that ignore the progress that has been made? The strides taken by so many individuals to overcome adversity? Isn't it unfair to paint an entire nation with such a broad brush?" Crockett's reply was measured but fierce. "Acknowledging systemic issues doesn't erase progress. It demands that we confront uncomfortable truths to ensure progress continues for everyone, not just a select few. Isn't true progress about honesty? About facing reality instead of rewriting history to make ourselves feel better?" Morgan scoffed, but there was a flicker of doubt behind his eyes. "But where do you draw the line? When does advocacy become victimhood? When does raising awareness turn into playing the race card?" The question struck like a blow. Crockett's jaw tightened, her voice steady but charged with conviction. "When the facts are ignored, when lived experiences are dismissed, And when people are forced to carry the burden of silence, then it becomes necessary to speak out. Isn't it more dangerous to remain silent in the face of injustice than to call it out? The studio audience was on edge. The cameras captured every micro-expression, every pause pregnant with meaning. Was this a battle for truth or a war of narratives? And who would emerge the victor? As Morgan pushed harder, Crockett countered with stories, statistics, and a depth of understanding that revealed the complexity behind the headlines. She painted a picture of communities still grappling with inequality, of families haunted by cycles of poverty and prejudice. Her words were not just rebuttals, they were calls to action. But then, just as the debate seemed to reach a crescendo, Morgan's tone shifted, a brief, almost imperceptible change that hinted at frustration rather than reason. The questions became sharper, more personal. Do you believe this country is fundamentally divided? And if so, do you think it can ever truly heal? Crockett's gaze locked with his, steady and unyielding. Divided? Yes. But healing is possible, if we choose truth over comfort. If we stop pretending the problem doesn't exist. Are we ready for that kind of honesty? The tension was unbearable. The studio held its breath. What would be the next move? Would Morgan respond with empathy or escalate the confrontation further? The moment hung thick in the air. Piers Morgan, known for his quick wit and sharp comebacks, stared at Jasmine Crockett with an intensity that suggested he was recalibrating his approach. The question of division and healing had cut deeper than the usual soundbite bait. Yet rather than soften, Morgan doubled down, his voice rising with a mix of disbelief and challenge. So you're saying this country can only heal if everyone admits to systemic racism? Isn't that just an excuse to keep people angry and divided? Couldn't healing come from moving past the past, rather than dwelling on it? The room bristled with anticipation. Crockett's expression remained composed, but behind her eyes burned a fierce resolve. Moving past the past requires acknowledging it first. Without that, you build a house on sand. Do you think we can really heal if we ignore the roots of the pain? Or are we simply pretending the wounds don't exist? Morgan's rebuttal was swift and sharp. But what about personal responsibility? Shouldn't people be held accountable for their own choices rather than blaming society? Here, Crockett leaned forward, her voice firm and unwavering. Personal responsibility is crucial, but it cannot exist in a vacuum. How do you hold someone accountable if the system itself stacks the deck against them? Is it fair to expect success when the starting line is miles behind for so many? The debate was no longer about policy or politics. It had become a fundamental clash of worldviews. Crockett was challenging the very framework Morgan used to interpret the world. Each question she posed felt like a mirror held up to the audience. What do we refuse to see? What truths do we bury under convenience and denial? Morgan, now visibly frustrated, pressed on. Isn't this focus on race tearing the country apart? Doesn't it foster resentment rather than unity? Crockett's response was calm but charged with passion. Unity without justice is nothing but silence. Can there be true unity without confronting inequality? Or are we mistaking a quiet that hides pain for peace? The viewers at home were left grappling with their own feelings. Was this confrontation merely a clash of personalities, or a reflection of a deeper societal fracture? How often do we dismiss discomfort as conflict instead of seeing it as a call for change? Suddenly, the tone shifted. Morgan, no longer content with debate, dropped a comment that shocked everyone. A remark so blunt, so provocative, that it stopped the conversation cold. For a moment the studio was silent, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. Jasmine Crockett's face registered a mixture of shock and resolve. The question now was, how would she respond? The studio was charged with electricity after Piers Morgan's sudden, provocative comment. The words hung in the air like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down in the midst of a fierce debate. Jasmine Crockett's moment of shock quickly transformed into steely determination. She refused to let the conversation spiral into chaos or be derailed by a careless remark. Morgan's comment, laced with implications that questioned Crockett's entire perspective, was more than just a statement. It was an attempt to undermine her credibility in front of millions. The audience felt the weight of the moment. What happened next would define not just the interview, but the very nature of discourse on race in media. Without missing a beat, Crockett responded with a measured yet powerful rebuttal. "If my perspective challenges your comfort, then perhaps it is your comfort that needs to change. We cannot afford silence when voices have been ignored for generations. Isn't it time we listen rather than dismiss?" The cameras zoomed in on Morgan's face. A rare flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. The power dynamics in the room shifted. Crockett's words carried the force of lived experience, undeniable facts, and moral clarity. The line had been drawn, and she was not stepping back. Morgan attempted to regain control, his tone sharper, more aggressive. "You claim to speak for millions, but do you really understand the views of those who disagree? Or are you trapped in an echo chamber that only reinforces your own beliefs?" Crockett's eyes burned with conviction. "Understanding does not mean agreeing. True dialogue requires respect and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. Are you prepared to have that kind of conversation, or are you content to provoke and dismiss?" The exchange grew more confrontational, but it was rooted in a deeper struggle, one between denial and acknowledgement, between maintaining the status quo and demanding change. The audience was riveted, watching history unfold in real time. Then, as if sensing the escalating stakes, Morgan launched one final attempt to shake Crockett. He challenged her integrity, her motivations, and her very role in the public debate. It was a gamble, a last-ditch effort to break her resolve. But Crockett was ready. With calm strength, she stood her ground, turning the tables and exposing the fragility behind Morgan's bravado. Her closing words in that heated moment left no room for doubt. "I am here because these issues matter, because silence is complicity. And if standing for truth makes me a target, then so be it." The studio erupted in applause. The confrontation had reached a crescendo, a turning point where courage met controversy. Yet this was not the end. It was the beginning of a reckoning. As the applause settled, the atmosphere in the studio shifted from confrontation to reflection. Jasmine Crockett's words had struck a chord, not only with those watching live, but with viewers across the nation who grappled daily with the realities she laid bare. The clash with Piers Morgan had transcended mere debate. It had become a moment of reckoning. Morgan, momentarily disarmed, tried to steer the conversation back to civility. Yet the dynamic had changed irreversibly. Crockett's poise and unyielding honesty had upended expectations. The audience sensed that this was more than a fleeting exchange. It was a challenge to the status quo, a call to reconsider how conversations about race were conducted in mainstream media. In the following moments, Crockett spoke not just as a politician or public figure, but as a voice for those too often silenced. She urged viewers to confront uncomfortable truths, to question narratives fed by complacency or denial. Her message was clear. Meaningful change requires bravery, empathy, and a willingness to listen, even when it is difficult. Morgan, though, still a formidable opponent, had to reckon with the power of conviction over rhetoric. The tension between them softened, replaced by a grudging respect born of shared understanding that some conversations are necessary, no matter how painful. As the segment closed, the question lingered for viewers. What does it truly mean to confront the difficult realities of race in this country? How far are we willing to go to break cycles of misunderstanding and division? And what role do each of us play in shaping a future defined by justice, rather than silence. Jasmine Crockett walked off the set with her head held high, her challenge laid bare for millions to witness. The clash with Piers Morgan was not just a headline, it was a turning point in a national conversation long overdue. The video ends with a powerful reminder that dialogue, even when uncomfortable, is the first step toward change. Will viewers take up the challenge? Will they look beyond the surface and demand more from their leaders, their media, and themselves? This confrontation might have ended, but the story it told is far from over.